Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Maggie Allen. I'm Special Projects Lead at Autistica and I'm delighted to be hosting the very last session of the Research Festival for 2022, which is on education. So we know that improving education provision for autistic people and young people is pivotal if they're to be able to achieve in later life. However, we also know that school environments and teaching practices are often not conducive to learning for autistic pupils, with a lack of understanding or effective training. This important topic will be the focus of this session, exploring education and its practices in relation to autism and autistic people. You can read about the speakers for this session just below in this live stream, along with a PDF version of the slides if you wish to see them in a different format. Some of our speakers will be joining us at the end for the live Q&A once their presentations are finished. And you can submit your questions via the Q&A system just below this video. These will be collated by my Autistica colleagues, and we will be trying to get round to answering as many of your questions as we can. Some of our presenters have agreed to share their email addresses. So if you have any further questions, we will put those in the Q&A system after the whole panel session has ended. So let's get right down into it with our first session with our first presenters, Mary Hanley and Debbie Riby.
Hello, my name is Mary Hanley. I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at Durham University, and I'm also one of the co-directors for the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development, which is a research centre at Durham University. Today I'm going to be telling you about research that we've been doing on what we call AAA. It's really about how differences with attention, arousal linked to sensory differences, and anxiety can impact on engagement and learning in the classroom for autistic children and young people. We've recently developed a free online training tool about AAA, and I'm firstly going to tell you a little bit about the research that has informed the training tool, and then a little bit about the training tool itself. The images that you can see here, which illustrate AAA, were designed by Ella Willis, an autistic digital illustrator, and I'd really like to acknowledge the brilliant work that Ella has done on this project. I'd also really like to acknowledge all of the teams that have contributed to the work that I'm going to tell you about. Researchers from the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development, the Communication Interaction team from Durham County Council, and most importantly, our advisory group of autistic people, parents, teachers, and autism researchers, all of whom have co-designed the AAA training tool. I want to start by thinking about the school environment, and particularly the classroom. Because classrooms are very busy, multisensory environments. There are lots of things that children have to filter out and ignore in order to be able to pay attention and learn in the classroom. For example, the sensory stimuli in this environment, like displays on classroom walls, but also the noise and bustle from a classroom full of lots of other children or young people or staff. It's quite an unpredictable environment. For some children and young people, it's very difficult to focus and learn in such an environment, especially those who have differences with attention, arousal and anxiety. And we know that autistic children and young people tend to experience all of these and to a greater extent than other people. In our work in the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development, we've been trying to understand the factors that are important for engagement and learning for autistic learners in a variety of different ways, using a variety of different methods and looking at different educational settings. It's work that has involved empirical studies with children looking at attention skills and how they predict academic achievement, work looking at manipulating aspects of the classroom environment and looking at impacts on attention and learning. Also the use of survey, questionnaires and interviews with parents and teachers looking at sensory and anxiety impacts at school. One of the really important points to come from this work is how these areas overlap. So the overlaps between attention, arousal and anxiety. And what I mean here is there have been studies where we've aimed to focus on one area, say sensory arousal, but it's been the overlap or the interaction with other areas like anxiety that's been really crucial to understand the outcome of engagement and learning. And that's really where the idea of AAA came from. The other really important thing is that to understand engagement and learning for autistic pupils, the tendency has been to focus largely on factors that are specific to individual children or young people. And actually what we really need to do is to understand the importance of the environment itself. Because of the time limit for this talk, I will focus on only 2 studies from this work. I'm going to summarise them now, before giving a very brief summary of the training tool that we've developed based on this work. The first study I want to tell you about was designed to understand the effect that classroom displays can have on attention and learning, especially for autistic pupils. To do this, we designed a series of videoed mini lessons that were 5 minutes each, and in half of the video lessons there were no displays in the background, and in half there were classroom displays present. We had autistic and non-autistic children watch these video mini lessons. We used eye tracking techniques to measure very precisely what children were looking at and for how long. And we measured learning at the end of each lesson with a bespoke assessment we created for each one. Firstly then, thinking about the results in relation to attention. The data on this graph shows how much attention children paid to the background when there were no displays present. And here you can see that both autistic and neurotypical children spent about 10% of the time, roughly, looking at the background in videos where there were no displays. And just to give you a sense of what that data looked like, here's a video that shows you the eye tracking data, so the attention patterns from 8 autistic participants as they watched a video with no displays in the background. And really what you can see here is that these children spent most of their time paying attention to the teacher as she relayed the content of the lesson verbally. In comparison, here's a video with gaze patterns from a different set of autistic participants, 9 autistic participants, as they watched a video with a high level of classroom displays. And what you can see here is that the attention patterns were different, and a lot of attention was given to the displays in the background. So just then looking at the overall findings for all children and for all videos. What you can see on the graph now is in red the amount of attention children paid to the background when there were displays present. And what you can see is that all children looked more at the background when there were displays compared to when there were no displays. And this was to a greater extent for the autistic compared to the neurotypical children. One question is, did it matter? Because you can look at one thing and think about another thing entirely. Here it did matter because the data showed that more looking at displays when they were present was predictive of poorer learning scores. And what that suggested to us is that classroom displays can be distracting, especially for autistic pupils. And you might say, well, that's very interesting, but how can we know if this bears any resemblance to actually what happens in a real classroom? Well, it's important to say that this is something we've replicated recently in a more realistic scenario. We designed our own mini classroom where we had children with and without autism complete classroom work in the mini classroom, and we manipulated the visual and auditory sensory information across different conditions, such as the displays on the walls. And you can see that in the picture on the slide just now. We recorded the children during these sessions, and we coded the videos for on and off task behaviour, and we looked at the impact of different sensory conditions on task behaviour. To highlight from this graph, we found that having visual displays on the walls, the conditions illustrated here in green and purple bars, this led to the greatest increase in off-task behaviour for all children, but to a greater extent for the autistic participants. This really mirrored the findings from our eye tracking study and suggests that sensory features of the classroom can impact attention and learning, especially for autistic children. These examples also emphasise the point I made earlier about the interaction between attention and sensory arousal and sensory aspects of the classroom. I've just given you a very brief snapshot of some of the evidence that contributes to our AAA work, here focusing on the importance of classroom sensory information on attention and learning. The other studies involved in this work looked in a lot more detail at the very significant sensory experiences that have the most impact at school, and also how anxiety acts as a barrier to learning for autistic pupils. And it's based on all of this work together, not just those examples I've showed today, that we've put forward this idea of AAA, and to try and really get a message out there about thinking about supporting autistic pupils at school with these kinds of challenges. And one of the key messages that underpins the AAA framework is on the impact of the school environment and how we really need to address the impact of the school environment. As a result of this research, we developed an online training tool which was really targeted at educators. And it was really about using research examples such as the ones I've just shared, as well as personal testimony from autistic people to try to change understanding of AAA issues at school. The training tool was co-designed with autistic people, with parents, with teachers, and also with other autism researchers. It's freely accessible to anybody who wants to register, and it takes about an hour and a half to complete from start to finish. And one of the key aspects of the training tool is that you can download a AAA toolbox, which is a set of practical support strategies to help children and young people who experience AAA challenges at school. The practical support strategies section of the training tool was developed in collaboration with the specialist advisory teachers at the communication and interaction team from Durham County Council. And in here there are 35 different strategies to support each different aspect of AAA. All of these can be tailored to individual children and young people. But really importantly, we're not saying this is a magic bullet and that this will solve all challenges at school, or even the AAA challenges are the only things we need to be thinking about at school. But what we do try to say is that using this training and using these practical support strategies, really that small changes can make a big difference. As just one example, and I've focused on attention in this talk, obviously the work and the training goes into much more detail on sensory impacts on anxiety. But as just one example here, this is about being selective about displays. So leading from the studies I talked about earlier, encouraging educators to audit their visual environment and to be selective about displays and whether they're actually needed and necessary, and whether they can reduce the amount of sensory information in the classroom environment. So just to summarise, I've briefly given you an overview of the work that we've been doing on AAA, how differences with attention, arousal and anxiety can have a massive impact on autistic pupils at school. And really one of the key messages we're trying to emphasise is about the school environment itself and how it can really lead to many challenges at school. We've used our research to develop the online training tool to support AAA, and the link is here on the slide. And at this point, I would just say thank you for your time and your interest in this work. I'm going to hand over to the chair of this session, who will introduce the next panel presentation. Please save any questions you may have about the work until the end of the session, where I will gladly answer them in the live Q&A.
Thank you, Mary and Debbie. It was really fascinating to learn about how something as simple as wall displays can have a real effect on how well autistic learners can concentrate on a teacher. So we're now going to move to our second speaker, Alyssa Alcorn.
Hi, I'm Dr. Alyssa Alcorn from the University of Edinburgh, and today I'm going to talk you through the evaluation study for the Learning About Neurodiversity at School project. There's a lot of people who've helped bring this project to life, both researchers and educators and artists. We've also had multiple sources of funding, one of which is Autistica, who helped support the development and release of these resources. This is a new package of classroom resources for mainstream primary schools to help them introduce the concept of neurodiversity in a way that's accessible and engaging for children in the 8 to 11 age group. And right now, schools might be teaching about other types of diversity, but they're usually not teaching about neurodiversity. So this is meant to be a teacher-delivered curriculum spread out over one school term, maybe even longer. And it is a whole class program. That's very important because neurodiversity is everybody's business. It doesn't only pertain to children who might have diagnoses right now. And I'm very pleased to say that LEANS, after a long wait, is now available for download for free anywhere in the world if you visit our project website. And I'll show that link again at the end of the talk. So a little bit more about LEANS. It covers 7 different topics, and that helps break up the resources and make them easier to deliver to. Our first topic, as you might expect, is about introducing neurodiversity terms and concepts. It then goes on to talk about differences in our learning and thinking and classroom experiences, different types of communication, needs and wants and classroom supports, fairness, friendship and peer relationships, and then a final summative or reflective unit that's about trying to make more positive and inclusive choices going forward in terms of how we treat other people at school. All of these units combine multiple types of resource items, and those items have complementary roles. We've got hands-on activities and discussions to directly experience the different points, but those also combine with stories about a fictional neurodiverse class. And fiction allows us to be specific about many different types of neurodivergent and neurotypical school experiences, but without putting any pupils in the real class on the spot to share about themselves unless they want to. We also have explainer videos for some of those tricky new vocabulary words and posters as a reminder of LEANS concepts in the classroom. The goals of LEANS overall are about trying to get beyond neurodiversity facts to get into what people believe and what they're doing at school. So our goals can be summarized as know, think, and do. Know is about increasing knowledge for pupils and staff of neurodiversity terms and concepts. Think is about creating more positive attitudes towards neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And the do goal is about trying to increase individuals' positive, inclusive actions within the school community. And I'm stressing within the school community because LEANS really is about learning about neurodiversity at school. It's not about the whole lifespan or about neurodiversity in all of society. It starts very concrete to help try to convince pupils and teachers that neurodiversity really does have to do with them and really is something that affects their daily lives and school experiences. So let's go on to the evaluation study and see how we're doing at meeting those goals. The evaluation goals had 2 types of does it work questions. The first one is about practicality. Even though education professionals were involved at developing LEANS at all the stages along the way, there is no substitute for taking something into a real classroom. So we wanted to see if LEANS was acceptable and feasible for real teachers and students. The second does it work question is about LEANS as a teaching tool. This is those know, think, do goals. Are people acquiring neurodiversity knowledge? Do they appear to be changing their attitudes or their intended actions? So in parallel to those goals, we also had some project goals, and these were about getting that teacher and pupil feedback and using them to revise the resources in order to produce the versions that are publicly available right now. In terms of who was in the study, we had 4 Scottish primary schools participating and 8 classes across those schools. 1 class needed to withdraw themselves due to time pressure, especially around COVID disruption, which meant we had 7 classes and 139 children finishing the LEANS program. Of those, we had 62 children formally enrolled in the study. That meant that their parents or carers gave permission for us to use their quiz data and also provided additional background information about those children. A little more about that group. We had 36 female children and 26 male children. The average age was just under 10 years, and we had about 18% of that group with parent-reported learning difficulties of some kind. And that was a mix of formally diagnosed challenges suspected but undiagnosed, and quite a few kids had both.
I'd like to pause here to say a really big thank you to our participating study schools and families and teachers. You all made a huge contribution to LEANS at a very difficult time. Thank you so much.
In terms of what schools actually did that I'm saying such a big thank you for, we had a pretty standard pre-test, post-test structure for the evaluation. Before seeing anything in LEANS, the whole class did a quiz about their attitudes and intended actions. And this was a quiz we developed specifically for LEANS. They also did a single neurodiversity definition question to try to find out how many children were familiar with that concept before doing the curriculum. Teachers then went ahead and delivered the LEANS curriculum over a period of weeks. The exact timing varied from class to class depending on their scheduling and absences. As they went, they kept a written diary about what it was like to deliver each of the units. Once they'd finished delivering LEANS, the whole class then did the attitudes and actions questionnaire again, and a new questionnaire about neurodiversity knowledge. This one was also created specifically for LEANS. We also asked pupils to write down some free responses of what they thought about LEANS and did a small number of interviews. Our hypotheses were that the mean scores on the attitudes questionnaire would increase from baseline to outcome. Also that the percentage of children who were able to correctly define neurodiversity would increase from baseline to outcome. For the neurodiversity knowledge questionnaire, we expected that children's scores would be significantly above chance. And here we're talking about chance levels because they did that quiz only once after finishing LEANS, instead of comparing 2 time points. So on those attitudes and actions questions, these were multiple choice, making judgments about school situations. For example, if someone was treated fairly or not, or choosing what they thought would be the best course of action. For example, if you saw someone and thought that they needed help. And we found here that the mean choice score did increase by a statistically significant amount, from about 4.5 to 5.62. So that means that at the end of LEANS, more children were endorsing attitudes and actions that reflected the principles in LEANS. So that is good news, and it means our hypothesis was supported. In terms of neurodiversity knowledge, our neurodiversity definition item, people were not doing so well at the pre-test point, actually worse than chance. However, after LEANS, we had almost 60% of children choosing the correct definition, so an increase of 42%. So that's good news there. In terms of the neurodiversity knowledge quiz scores, we had an average score of 5.08 out of a possible 8. So this is significantly above chance level. So that is also very good news. It means that both of those neurodiversity knowledge hypotheses were supported also. So let's go over to the free response and see some things that pupils had to say about what they learned in LEANS. One wrote, I learned about neurodiversity and how brains process info differently, depending on whether they are neurodivergent or neurotypical. And information processing is a big concept that runs through LEANS, so it's really nice to hear somebody mentioning that. There is a difference between need and want. I learned a lot more about fairness. Both of those are also big concepts in LEANS, especially equity-based ideas of fairness. Someone else wrote, people are different and shouldn't feel that they have to change. We also got a really nice comment where a child wrote, please continue to teach children about neurodivergent people. We also asked teachers in their written diaries whether they thought that LEANS had had an impact on their class, and if so, what that impact was. One teacher wrote, I think that studying LEANS genuinely made an impact on the class. Individual children felt and explained that they recognized themselves as neurodivergent in different ways, and they appeared to have a penny drop moment. I think it helped children to have a better understanding of the way others are/feel, and also why learning can be different and is delivered differently to them. Another teacher wrote, they, pupils, realized that having a laptop at writing time and other supports all allowed children to have the same access to the curriculum. There's a better sense of empathy within the class and understanding, a tolerance and acceptance. Another commented, parents of neurodivergent children were very happy we were exploring this concept in class. So that's just a small selection of their comments. But it sounds like overall that they did believe that LEANS was having some positive impacts in their class, even though there might be more to do with certain of the concepts. Final note about evaluation feedback is pupils and teachers gave us lots of really constructive feedback, a lot of which could be summed up in 2 words, too long. So we spent a lot of time cutting content out of the stories and revising down the teacher guidance and instructions to try to be simpler and cut repetition. Also now we're recommending a longer delivery time scale to spread out the reading and preparation work. So all of those changes are reflected in the final versions of the resource, which are available now from our project website. So I'd encourage you to visit us online, download the resource, and join our mailing list to make sure that you don't miss what's coming up next with more resources for families and for education professionals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alyssa. I think it would be such a hugely positive thing to bring an understanding of neurodiversity into the classroom. So we have to move now to Jane and Kerry. Thank you, Jane. Over to you.
Hello everyone. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk to you about the Autism Spectrum Social Stories in Schools trial. I'm Kerry and I'm going to be taking you through the first half of the presentation, and then I'll pass over to my colleague Jane to take you through the rest of it. So to give you an overview of the trial, we wanted to establish whether social stories are clinically and cost-effective in improving children's social responsiveness, reducing behaviours that challenge, and improving social and emotional health in children with autism spectrum condition within primary schools. The trial was funded by the National Institute for Health Research, and we recruited children between the ages of 4 and 11 years old who had a diagnosis of ASC from across the Yorkshire and Humber region. So what are social stories? You might have an idea of what social stories are already because there's lots of different types floating around out there. But the types that we were interested in this project were first developed by Carol Gray specifically for autistic children. They reflect a less time-consuming and intrusive intervention, and they can be used to describe social situations or skills that a child on the autism spectrum may otherwise find difficult. They follow a very clear set of rules and criteria, and they're highly personalised and tailored to very specific behaviours, skills or situations. So what can social stories be used for? Well, they can be used for all sorts of different things. So for example, understanding routines, so understanding the school day, the school structure, what happens first, what happens next. They can be used to give reassuring information. They can be used to understand emotions, both the child's personal emotions and the emotions of others. And they can be used to prepare for transitions or new experiences. For example, when a child is moving from primary to secondary school, sometimes we can write a social story around what might look like to prepare the child for that experience. So to give you an overview of the structure of the trial, we first started by recruiting participants in schools. We then collected some data from them, which is known as baseline data, and this is collected before the trial starts. The schools were then randomised to one of 2 arms. In the first arm, social stories training was given straight away, and in the second arm, schools continued their care as usual whilst being placed on a wait list to receive the social stories training later. We then developed the stories in collaboration with the schools, and the schools were then asked to read the stories with the children a minimum of 6 times within a 4-week period. We then collected some data at 6 weeks and 6 months post randomisation, and after all that was complete, we could then provide training to the schools that were allocated to the waitlist. So the social stories training itself took 2 different sort of formats because the trial was disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So initially we hosted a 3-hour session based within the school. where we gave a presentation about autism and about the stories, and then we supported the teaching assistants to write the stories whilst we were there. But after the COVID-19 pandemic struck and we were all forced to work remotely, we moved to an online training model where we hosted an online training presentation. We then held a virtual writing session. We then asked the interventionists within the schools to format the stories. We checked that they were okay, and then they were free to start delivering the stories within schools. So 249 children on the autism spectrum were recruited from schools across the Yorkshire and Humber. For each participating child, we also recruited their primary parent or caregiver, a teacher and an interventionist. In total, 201 educational professionals and parents or carers were trained, and 129 social stories were written throughout the course of the trial. As I said before, COVID did have an impact on this trial. So as you'll know, schools were closed between March 2020 and September 2020, and then again in January 21 and March 21, which obviously held up recruitment for us somewhat and meant that the trial couldn't be delivered during those periods of time. So baselines, randomisations, intervention delivery and follow-ups were all affected, and we had to come up with some creative ways to deal with that. We did have some participant withdrawals and school capacity issues and children becoming ineligible during the periods of school closures. And as I said before, we did have to change the training model to an online training model to reflect social distancing. So we found that children who received social stories scored lower on the social responsiveness scale, though this wasn't statistically significant and did not meet our expected minimum clinically important difference. But for children who received the social stories intervention as intended, the impact on the social responsiveness scale too was much greater. It's unclear what impact the COVID-19 pandemic had on the results, as this did cause significant disruption during the latter half of the trial, and many children didn't receive the intervention as it was intended. So after 6 months, children who received social stories were meeting the goal set for them more frequently than children who received their usual in-school care. There was no strong evidence of an impact on other outcome measures, such as mental and physical health, parent well-being, or children's quality of life. We did undertake an economic evaluation and found that social stories represent a low-cost, low-burden intervention, and the economic evaluation concluded that social stories could be considered cost-effective based on the current willingness to pay thresholds. I'll now hand over to my colleague Jane to take you through the rest of the presentation. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Jane. I'm going to talk you through the qualitative study results which explored the views of the parents, carers, educational professionals and the research team who took part in our trial. We aim to interview 20 participants to explore the challenges and barriers to training and the implementation of the intervention, and we wanted to understand how willing school staff were to run the intervention independently. We selected participants from the cohort of social stories trainers, interventionists and associated teachers, and we also invited the parents who had been able to attend the social stories training too. We were aiming for maximum variation across our sample in terms of the age of the participants, the gender, time in the profession and experience with autistic children. We also conducted focus groups with the social stories trainers and the study research assistants to explore their experiences delivering the training and setting the goals for the social stories with the associated teachers and the parents. In total, we interviewed 21 participants, and this included 5 teachers, 7 interventionists and 9 parents and carers. These were a mixture of individuals who had attended the in-person training model and the online training model post-COVID-19. The individuals represented both small and large primary schools from rural and urban areas. For the focus groups, we interviewed 4 social stories trainers, and we also interviewed 6 research assistants, and these were a mixture of study team members who had been involved in going into schools in person to set the goals for the social stories, and also the research assistants who joined the trial after COVID-19 and set the goals for the social stories via video conference with parents and teachers. All interviews were recorded and professionally transcribed, and we made sure all the data was anonymised. The research team took time to become familiar with the data, and we identified the main themes within the interview, particularly focusing on the participants' experience before the intervention, during the intervention, and after the intervention. All decisions during the thematic analysis were double-checked by a second team member, and the analysis was overseen by a qualitative expert. So the areas explored within the interviews were the participants' motivations to take part, their previous experience of using social stories, their views on participating in our trial, and their views on the intervention itself. We also explored their experiences delivering the intervention within school, the impact of the intervention on the child, and we also asked them to explore the impact of COVID on the trial and on the child themselves. We also asked them about the future use of social stories and whether they would be keen to continue using this intervention within school. We found that the majority of participants had some experience of social stories, but the experience wasn't often of Carol Gray social stories that we were testing in our research project. The majority of the children appeared to enjoy their social story, and the interventionist reported positive benefits of both attending the training and delivering the intervention with the child. Interventionists reported that the story opened up a conversation with the child and helped the child to better understand social situations, and some noticed changes in the child's behaviour following the social story. Educational professionals recommended delivering the story somewhere that feels safe for the child and is free of distractions, but acknowledge that this can sometimes be difficult to find within a school setting. Participants reported that the frequency the story is read should be tailored to each individual child. So as you can see from the quote on the left, some children loved the repetition and some children found it difficult to engage with the story after the first reading. Educational professionals highlight that one of the barriers to using social stories is finding the time to write and deliver them within school, and this was particularly challenging due to the COVID disruption. The majority of participants would like to continue using social stories, but said that they would benefit from some refresher training or follow-up support. So in summary, the results suggest that social stories do not lead to significant changes in the social responsiveness of children on the autism spectrum. However, children who received the social stories intervention more frequently met the SMART goal set for them by their teacher than children who received the usual care alone. No other significant differences were found between the intervention group and the control group on other mental and physical health outcome measures. The qualitative results suggest that parents and educational professionals found the social stories training and the intervention beneficial and would like to continue using them. And some recommendations for practice. We believe that social stories should be highly tailored to the individual child and follow the Carol Gray criteria. Social stories should be written and delivered by someone who knows the child well and has established rapport with the child. It is important that social stories are delivered in a quiet, safe space, ideally free from distractions. Collaboration between parent, carers and educational professionals is key for success in providing the best support for children on the autism spectrum. We would like to thank all the children, parents and carers and educational professionals who participated in our study. We'd also like to thank the wider Assist2 team who worked really hard on the trial. Thank you very much for listening, and I will now pass back to the chair.
Thank you to Jane and Kerry. Fascinating piece of research looking at social stories. So we are now going to move over to our Q&A session. So I'm going to invite our speakers back. Okay, so thank you to everyone for joining us and for your time and the effort you put into such brilliant presentations. So I have a question to start us off, and this is for Mary. A really, really interesting talk. Did the impact of looking elsewhere on academic attainment differ at all between autistic and neurotypical pupils?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So you're talking about the eye tracking study there, I think that we spoke about first, where we looked at the impact of the presence of displays on learning from videoed mini lessons, and we included autistic and non-autistic children. And we reported that autistic children spend significantly more time looking at displays compared to non-autistic children. And we also reported how looking at displays predicted poorer learning for everyone. And your question is, given that autistic children spent more time looking at displays, did they have a bigger impact on their learning as such? And the answer is yes, although that effect in this study was a small negative effect. So I think the difference between the groups for learning scores in the lessons that had displays present was about a 1 point difference. That is a small negative effect, but what I would say is, in the context of a study where children are watching 5-minute video lessons, that's probably not a small thing to think about. So even in a short space of time, actually looking at displays can have important impacts on learning. And in this case, as we found, to a greater extent for autistic children.
Thank you. Our next question is for Alyssa. Teachers are often known to be overwhelmed with very little time. If completing the LEANS training, do they feel like they have time to implement any lessons within everyday practices and environments?
Thank you, Maggie. I think this is a case where the very short talk meant that I wasn't able to give the clearest explanation of what LEANS actually is. And when I kept saying it's a resource pack, what that means is it is a package of stuff for children to do in class, along with materials to help teachers prepare to teach neurodiversity potentially for the first time. So what LEANS is the stuff for them to do in class. And if they're not doing that, they're not doing the program. So at least in our evaluation study last fall, when we all know that there was just COVID disruption up to the eyeballs, we still had 7 out of our 8 classes go all the way through the content. And one class, I think, just decided it was best for them to focus on something else at that time. And from their feedback, we have, you know, as you say, teachers are often overwhelmed, and we use the feedback from that study to try to trim down the resources as much as possible while keeping the essential learning objectives. But I do want to stress that if teachers are sort of looking at the training guidance aspect, but not doing the activities with their class, they're not doing the program.
Thank you for clarifying that, Alyssa. So, Jane, we've got a question for you. What goals did social stories help children achieve or work towards?
Thank you. So the goals for the children that were set, they were set by both the teacher and in collaboration with the parents. And there was a range of goals which sort of reflected how diverse the population of children in our study were. So the goals range from things to do with communicating emotions, understanding routines within schools. So we've got things like telling the teachers how I feel, or trying to put my hand up in class. And what we were hoping to do with the goals is not set the children up to fail. So the goals were always, I will try to do this, or I will try to do that. And the goals always had really positive language because we wanted the stories to be a positive experience for the child. But the Carol Gray guidance on writing social stories says that as long as the goal is specific and realistic for the child, you can pretty much write a goal about anything. So they're very flexible intervention.
Thank you, Jane. So we've got time for a couple more questions. So we've got a question here for Mary and Debbie. So have teachers and educators been welcoming and open to thinking about how to adapt school environments?
Our teachers been welcoming and opening and thinking about how to adapt school environments? That's a really good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we can fully answer that as yet. So the AAA tool launched in March, and over 1,200 teachers have completed the training. And we have data from a proportion of those teachers who have given ratings on how useful they have found the training, how much they've learned, and we have data on their willingness to implement some of those practices and use the tools, because there are over 35 tools in the toolbox that they can download to use in different ways. So it's not just about classroom displays. There's lots in there around all elements of the AAA, the anxiety issues, sensory issues, etc. So that's just one part of the training. So I'm not sure we can totally pull out that data at the moment.
The only thing I would add is at the moment, in terms of our approach to translating this research to practice, we've obviously designed an online training too. So as Debbie said, there's been over 1,200 people who've completed it, signed up to complete it so far, which is wonderful. But of course, the people who've signed up to complete it are probably people who are intrinsically motivated to understand AAA issues and who, and in fact, most of them say they are looking for ways to support neurodivergent learners and develop their sort of knowledge and skill set, which is wonderful. What that does mean though, is we're probably preaching to the choir a little bit. And actually what we're doing next in this AAA work is developing a whole school training program. So I guess it's similarities with the approach Alyssa and the team have taken with Leans in terms of trying to get into a school and work with groups within a school all at once, not just targeting individual people. So we're trying to convert the online training tool into a whole school program that would be delivered as part of the school's CPD training. And in that way, trying to get school leaders involved and trying to get a consistency of practice around all of the things that AAA speaks to, one of which of course is use of displays.
Thank you. We've got an absolutely brilliant question here for Alyssa. Should schools focus on neurodiversity training or autism training? Is neurodiversity better, being a more inclusive and fuller approach?
I think that's an interesting question to which I will probably give an unsatisfactory answer, because schools obviously are a hugely heterogeneous group in terms of what they might be doing now, if anything, about particular diagnostic labels like autism. They're probably not very likely to be teaching about neurodiversity right now. So this really depends on, you know, what's the goal here? What is the school trying to do? Because those two things would potentially have different impacts and different reasons that you might choose to do them. I will say in terms of teaching about neurodiversity specifically, I think it avoids some of the diagnostic gatekeeping issues that we know are such a huge headache around autism, in terms of many children and young people not getting diagnosed at all, or it takes years and years, or they may have multiple diagnoses at the same time, and staff may not really understand the intersections of those very well. You know, neurodiversity is much more of a broad church in that it literally includes everyone. Neurodiversity is about differences and diversity within a group, such as a classroom or a school community. So that means that everybody has a stake in that idea and how it affects the school community and people's experiences. And I think that can be really, really powerful. On the other hand, depending on what might be going on with individual, pupils who have autism diagnoses, there simply may not be a substitute for really dedicated training for their staff members about understanding the specific implications of autism. So I think there's definitely room for both, and the priority depends on what a school might be doing now already.
Thanks, Alyssa. Jane, should social stories be used for all children, or should it depend on the children's communication and responsiveness to images?
Thank you. Well, within our study, our eligibility criteria was that children were able to just understand a simple short story. So we would always recommend that teachers or parents make a judgment about whether the children are receptive to be able to take in the information from a short, simple story. And one of the Carroll Gray criteria is that the stories are always personalised to the ability and understanding level of that child. We were also very much encouraging different forms of delivering the story. So for some children, they found it very difficult to sit down and listen to a short story. So we would recommend printing off pages and maybe putting them around the classroom and allowing the child to wander around and look at different pages, or potentially letting the child read the story for themselves or do a different activity while listening to the story. So I think you can very much tailor whether it's suitable for a child and sort of make it suitable for them, given their preferences and their ability level. So yeah, as long as they can take in simple information, I think it would be appropriate for most children.
Thanks, Jane. So thank you to all of our speakers. We've had some brilliant questions by our audience, so our audience has been fabulous as well. So thank you for all of the responses and the brilliant questions we've had. So email addresses are going to be placed in the Q&A system now. If you would like to ask speakers for any further questions, do post them into there now. And so we are coming to the end of our speaker sessions at the 2022 Autistica Research Festival. It's been an absolute blast of a week, and it's now going to be over to Rebecca, who will be delivering the closing speech for the festival. I really hope you've had a fantastic time, everyone. We've really loved it, and we look forward to enjoying having you with us next year.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I'm Rebecca. I'm a Director of External Affairs at Autistica, and I'm just stepping in for James to thank you all for joining us. What a week this has been. I hope you've enjoyed the sessions as much as I have. The range of views, the experiences, and the world-class science has left me feeling more excited than ever about the potential that we have here in the UK to really make progress for autistic people. Everyone who has joined the festival is incredibly dedicated to changing the world for autistic people. But the next step is translating this passion and these valuable insights into real world change. That's why at Autistica, we're prioritising a set of goals to achieve by 2030. And it's why we're doing much more than just funding research. We'll be working with government and the Department of Health to share emerging evidence and real-life experiences to ensure that funding and policy change offers practical evidence-based support. We'll be focusing on two areas: support from day one and evidence-based anxiety treatments. We'll be working with companies, with recruiters and with job centres to ensure that autistic people have access to fulfilling and supportive work. We'll be working with public services to ensure that their spaces are accessible to all autistic people. And we'll be working alongside other organisations and influential public figures to change attitudes towards neurodiversity and autistic people. Research will be at the heart of all of these conversations. And I hope that next year at the festival, we can update you on how the research shared this week and the partnerships we've formed since then are driving real progress for autistic people. Firstly, I want to thank all of those that made the festival possible. Firstly, to our incredible speakers who took time out to prepare their presentations and joined us live to answer your questions. Thank you also to my amazing team who worked behind the scenes so hard on the festival this year, namely to Mercedes, who led the event, and it's just her first year at Autistica. She's really done an amazing job to organise this huge event. Thank you to Fujitsu as well. They're our sponsors for the third year in a row, and their support has meant that we can continue to offer the festival as a free event accessible to absolutely everyone. We hope that you've had a positive experience at the Autistica Festival, but we do want to continually improve. We want to make it relevant, engaging and accessible for years to come. We'll send round a questionnaire by email at the end, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future Autistica events. Do join the Autistica Network if you're not already a member. You can hear about the latest research opportunities, events and updates from the charity. Thank you again so much for joining us and for participating in this great event. We hope you have a good evening and a good weekend. Thank you.